The FDA, they said, does not put quotes in Pfizer press releases. A little secret for your audience, Anna, and I haven't shared this. Silicon Valley is going to be the big, disruptor, and that Sanofi will be replaced by Amazon to create new pathways of data flow. Because if we in pharma do not, patients don't need us. You don't have to have the budgets of big pharma to access electronic data capture anymore. People can do more and more of this on their own. You could launch a research kit study using Apple tools for free.
Welcome to Industry Voice. Today, I will be interviewing a person who has been at the forefront of digital R&D innovation in the life science industry. A person who has been transforming clinical research, bringing light to digital innovation and patient engagement. Please meet Craig Lipset.
Greg, it's really great to see you. I was informed by our production crew that we've been waiting for a shot at booking you for the show for a couple of years now. So it's a great honor to finally have you with us today.
And I'm not that hard to find now, but I am delighted to be here with you in your community.
Thank you. So I suggest we start with the elephant in the room. You've been a very vocal advocate for decentralization of clinical trials and certainly contributed a lot to develop that area. How would you evaluate the current state of affairs in that realm of decentralized trials, and how far have we come?
That's a great question. Over the last 2 years, there's a slide that I've used at different conferences and for different talks about the adoption curve around decentralized and what we can expect. And in many ways, we're just living right where we're supposed to be, or where we could have predicted we would be on that curve. Certainly prior to the pandemic, adoption was flat at best. There were interesting little experiments people might run in different pockets in their organizations. And in the peak of the lockdowns of the pandemic, adoption was fierce. As we start to see beyond the pandemic, it's only natural that there would be some hesitation in organizations, ambiguity about regulations and other challenges in terms of where people are in implementing in their own organizations. The fact that we're still in an economic recession, or whatever we want to consider this period of ambiguity from our economics, only exacerbates that challenge. But we are getting regulatory ambiguity, and we are seeing these pathways to adoption. And so what I would expect us to see over the coming 2 to 3 years is not a straight line straight back up the adoption curve, but it will be a little bit of waxing and waning. We'll see spikes of adoption when regulators disambiguate and make things clear. And we'll see folks hesitate a bit if there's a concern within a given country. But overall, we'll continue to see a net upward movement. Part of that is because the regulators are removing ambiguity. They are releasing, as we saw in Europe in December, recommendations on decentralized trials. We'll see from the FDA the same later this year. We've seen from China, Japan, and others positions going forward beyond the pandemic. But importantly, we've also seen what adoption at scale is looking like inside of pharma companies, inside of the sponsors themselves. We actually have videos on this at dtra.org with presentations from Pfizer, Sanofi, Boehringer, Otsuka, and others talking about what adoption at scale looks like. What are their internal commitments? When the pharma companies are normalizing these approaches, when the regulators are removing ambiguity, I think we have a very good understanding of what adoption will continue to mean going forward.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I appreciate it. And we know that everyone has been talking a lot about artificial intelligence lately. And if we talk about clinical research in particular, what role does artificial intelligence play in fostering decentralization?
There's such great use cases for AI just across clinical development in general, and so many are in different stages of maturity, whether it's upfront during study design and planning, or during study conduct to help support automation and data flow and connectivity, whether it's around new endpoints powered by digital biomarkers and wearables, or whether it's our opportunity to reduce the number of patients in a control arm by creating synthetic patients and synthetic controls. Specifically, specifically in terms of helping to catalyze decentralized research, we'll certainly see as a part of that AI and diverse data for study design and planning, important places for artificial intelligence to help make recommendations during protocol design for what decentralized tools and methods might make sense. But to your point about the wearable, sensor, digital endpoint space, clinical trials in general need more resilient endpoints, and decentralizing research needs those endpoints to be location flexible. We even see this in that recommendation paper from the European regulators issued just last December. This consistent theme of needing to have confidence that our endpoints can be measured regardless of if a patient is at home or in the clinic in a consistent way. Remember, there are only two rules of clinical trials when it comes to regulators: no compromising patient safety, demonstrating confidence in data integrity. And that's the case with our measurements. Now, I mentioned earlier, our endpoints today are fragile. They require meticulous oversight in controlled settings, thinking about common measurements like a 6-minute walk test. Having a patient walk for 6 minutes shouldn't be such a feat that they have to go to the clinic in order for this complicated procedure to take place. But because our endpoints are so, when I say fragile, I mean they are delicate, that if they're done slightly differently today, we risk the entire trial being placed in jeopardy because our measurement confidence might be off. Digital measurements, AI coupled with sensors and wearables helps us create more resilient measures, because that wearable is on the patient's wrist all day or in their pocket on their phone. And so we need this in general. Decentralized will demand this even more so, to give us that flexibility that the patient doesn't have to be in a clinic just to get a good endpoint measured.
But I feel like when we talk about decentralized clinical trials, it's very important to point out that the level of tech advancement and adequate infrastructure varies from country to country. So we cannot just summarize decentralization, right? So with that in mind, how is the industry going to manage such barriers and make a universal shift towards innovative solutions?
When we see the direction sponsors are taking for decentralized in general, we hear terms like optionality and choice, and we often hear those through the lens of the patient. We know that not all patients want a home visit. We know that not all patients want to see their investigator over video. What we actually know is more and more patients tell us they certainly like their experience with investigators. The challenge is they can't always get there. It's an accessibility issue. And so how do we aspire to a future of decentralized that gives patients, people, choice and flexibility? The same will be true on a country by country basis. There are many exciting technological advancements or processes that we can't deploy the same on a global basis. Patient recruitment efforts vary on a country by country basis. Our ability to use real world data vary on a country by country basis, sometimes based on regulations, some based on policies such as privacy rules, and others just based on culture and preferences that may vary on a region by region basis. Our goal shouldn't necessarily be to expect that everything is normalized, even though it would make our lives as operators that much easier. But how do we create resilient approaches that give choice and flexibility, whether on a patient basis, on a site basis at times, but also on a country basis? We had this one session we did, I think it was last year, with some friends from Sanofi, and we themed that one on, if I can't do it everywhere, can I do it anywhere? It's almost in some organizations, this mindset that simply because I can't do X in country Y, can I therefore not do it in any country in which my trial is conducting? And I think most mature and advanced operators in the clinical trial space appreciate that we absolutely can.
And I agree with you. But are there any challenges in conducting decentralized clinical trials?
Well, there are a few, for sure. As I mentioned earlier, there are those challenges around regulatory ambiguity. We are a risk-averse ecosystem, rightfully so, because we do operate in a space where patients are being exposed to investigational medicines. We do have to be thoughtful and stepwise in many spaces. Regulatory ambiguity does create consternation, hesitation, makes it difficult to plan and execute. We often have other sources of data that create new pathways of data flow, and those need to be mapped out and planned ahead. Our user experience for patients is getting better and better, but our experience for sites is still very clunky, and it leaves sites behind. Whether we want to consider that site burden or whether we want to consider it that we're not setting up our sites well to succeed, we need to make sure that our investigators and site staff find it easier to say yes and want to make these options available for patients who very often rely on them in order to have access to research. Importantly, we have to make sure that we have proper oversight tools and data flow for our investigators to do their jobs. When we have visiting nurses going from one solution and data flow coming from lots of different places, the investigator still has an obligation to the patient in terms of oversight and safety. And it's growing even more and more important for us to make sure that we're showing that up front in our study design and planning. We're even seeing messaging from the regulators in Europe in that recommendation paper suggesting that sponsors should show their flow and their plan for investigators to have proper oversight in these trials. I think at DTRA, the Decentralized Trials Research Alliance, a nonprofit collaboration I help chair, we're trying to address many of those. And when we can't address them, at least creating micro communities where people can share and learn best practices together.
And since you already started talking about FDA and EMA and how they feel about decentralized clinical trials, I wanted to go into more depth with FDA. So what do you think is their current stand on such studies?
At our DTRA annual meeting last fall, we had representatives from FDA, from EMA, from some other regions on a panel together. This was in November. The representative from EMA said, "You will get a Christmas gift from EMA. There will be recommendations from us on DCT," and she delivered on that. The FDA voice made pretty clear that he was not going to put a date on his gift of guidance on decentralized, but we know that they've been working on this, and we know now that with the omnibus spending bill that was approved in the US back in December at the end of last year, it included a requirement for the FDA to deliver on guidance. I think the regulators knew that bill was coming. The language was in the public domain in the Diverse Trials Act, the DEPICT Act, which both focused on diversity in trials. And so it didn't surprise me that they might have waited for that bill to pass. And hopefully we'll see those guidance very soon. But keep in mind, this is not a new topic for the regulators. Way back in 2011, when I was at Pfizer, we issued a press release on doing the remote study we were planning, the very first fully decentralized clinical trial. And I remember a conversation with a comms team over at Pfizer when I told them that before we finalize that press release, hold on, the FDA wants to include a quote in that press release. If you look back at that June 2011 press release from Pfizer, there's a quote from Janet Woodcock. And the reason that you see that quote is the FDA wanted a signal that they are open for innovation. It was that they were receptive to people bringing forward new approaches. Fast forward 7 years from there, when CITI, the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, released recommendations on decentralized trials, it wasn't pharma sponsors that pushed for that. It was the FDA representatives themselves. And so time and again, the FDA has been a bit ahead of the industry on this space. That being said, the FDA is a complex organization. we all are operating in complex organizations that are managing change. We will see guidance, we will get clarity from leaders at FDA, but we still need to bring along all of the organization, just like we do at the Pfizers of the world and the big CROs of the world. These are complex. So that means that our reviewers, our inspectors also need to come along, and we have to be engaging and sharing our plans when it comes to using these decentralized approaches. There'll be clarity with that guidance, but it still means we have to be deliberate in our planning and engaging with our regulators to share what those plans are.
And now moving on to patient enrollment, such a huge portion of clinical research. Any tips on how to enroll patients and keep them engaged in decentralized trials?
It's funny. I think when it comes to enrollment, I'm not sure that it's radically different. Yes, we can be more expansive around our zip codes. Social media or otherwise always allowed us to do different, either targeting by geography or opening those channels up a bit. I think that, there may be new opportunities for us to take better advantage of real world data and electronic health records to support enrollment, because we might now have ways that mean that the patient might or will less likely be a patient of the investigators in that doctor's EHR for their practice. The patient may be coming from practices far and away, somewhere in some other geography. But I think the second half of your question gets very interesting when we think about engagement. Right? Because decentralized should never mean that a patient feels like they're left on their own. There was one survey out of Europe, I think it was about 2.5 years ago, that showed us how patients are receptive to these new approaches. They're not afraid of a wearable device or, a study being made decentralized. They just don't want to be left alone with these unfamiliar things. Now, decentralized done right should make a person feel that they're even more connected to their providers and their care team, right? If we're using chat or more frequent opportunities for video or other ways for a person to feel a better connection, decentralized done wrong means a person's just getting a box in the mail and being expected to take an investigational medicine and just click and send data off. So I think we're going to see a bit of a learning curve out there about how decentralized can actually help fortify a connection between the patient and the investigator rather than disrupt and make that negative. Honestly, I think we're seeing that with healthcare. Patients able to message their providers through their patient portals or have more frequent visits because of video. I think in healthcare, what we're seeing is patients like these approaches, but medical practices aren't resourced yet to handle them. And I think we'll have the same with our investigator sites. These can make connections better, but we may have to fund and support our investigator sites a little differently. There may be different items in the budget to help support our investigators to do this type of engagement and keep it done right.
And you mentioned the enrollment through various social media channels. How effective are they? We talk about Facebook, LinkedIn, maybe some other channels as well.
I'm not sure, to be honest, on which channels are going to be right for which. When I was at Pfizer, one future that I was really optimistic about was one that we could use marketplaces to start to open up, expand, and disrupt some of the recruitment channel logjam. There were lots of places we could go to find patients who might be eligible, but when we had business models that were very one-to-one, that we as a sponsor had to contract with this vendor and we as a sponsor had to contract with that vendor, it just made it prohibitive in terms of how many channels we could engage. And today, I think I see at least 3 different marketplace-like opportunities that help open doors for lots of entities that may have access to patients and a legal and ethical ability to engage those patients in research. And by marketplace, those who have that access, whether it's a community or whatever it may be, they don't have to call up and contract with Pfizer in order to be able to stimulate those referrals and participate. They could do it in a more accessible way through these types of brokered marketplaces. Whether it's a social channel, whether it's another one, hopefully that type of disruption will democratize things even further, because that's the beauty of so much of technology today in our space, is democratizing, making it easier for more people to participate, whether you're a patient or whether you're a vendor.
And thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I think that our audience will find it very useful if we talk about the enrollment in particular and engagement. When talking about the decentralized clinical trials, we cannot help mentioning telemedicine. What's your take on that?
Telemedicine adoption in the United States certainly spiked during the pandemic. And why did it? There were three things that we fixed in the United States on a temporary basis. We fixed reimbursement so that providers could be compensated fairly for their time. We fixed interstate licensing, because we have had models in the United States where people could only see their doctors if they were licensed in that particular state, which made it hard to see a doctor on a screen who may have been on the other side of the river or the other side of a bridge or state line. And we fixed we suspended some of the technology barriers that might have been in the way. Now, for clinical trials, we don't necessarily have a reimbursement challenge. We pay for things in the clinical trial that from a sponsor level. We don't need insurance companies to pay for that. Interstate licensing, though, will still remain an issue for us as clinical researchers, because we still are being restricted in terms of what state a physician as an investigator has to be in to see a given patient. I had one sponsor call me last year, Anna. They had a rare disease program, and they said, we're going to try something different. We're going to do a mass screening event for these rare patients. We're flying them into New York. We're flying in our highest performing investigator from, somewhere, I think in maybe Minnesota. And we're going to do this all in New York. So we have an investigator from Minnesota. We have patients from across the country, and we're going to be in a hotel room in New York. What license is needed for the physician who's going to be seeing these patients? And why do we have to have this debate? Now, I'm gonna drop a little secret for your audience, Anna, and I haven't shared this very broadly, so this will be a little inside information for your friends. In the President's State of the Union in the US this week, it wasn't in his spoken remarks, but when you look at the written information that was released before his spoken remarks, the president had announced increased support at the Department of Health and Human Services to help address interstate licensing to improve telemedicine access for mental health in this country. That is a huge opening of the door for us all. Because if we can enable telemedicine access for mental health across state lines, clinical trials should be able to start to move its way through that same opening of the door. So I'm really excited about that. I'm sorry it wasn't actually in his spoken remarks, but that's okay. It's in writing, and
some
people
breaking
can find
news.
that. Absolutely. So folks should keep some optimism out there about telehealth, because look, the adoption obviously slid back after the pandemic, in part because providers weren't getting reimbursed the same. But my wife, a family physician, still sees patients twice a week on telehealth, something she never did before the pandemic. And so, yes, we've slid back, but it doesn't mean we've slid all the way back. It was, 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
And at the end, we always ask our speakers to share their thoughts on how the industry is going to look like in another decade. So could you please share your thoughts on that?
I'm not going to be the person saying that Silicon Valley is going to be the big, disruptor, and that Sanofi will be replaced by Amazon and Merck will be replaced by Google. I'm not sure why those big tech companies would want to be in this space anyway. I mean, granted, we should be able to make things more predictable through technology and data, but it is still science and it's still incredibly hard to predict, even with better data. We will see substantially more automation in our space. We will see more automation of a digital protocol driving automation and processes all the way through to regulatory submissions. And that will radically change what the vendor landscape looks like. I think that will be extremely disruptive to the current CRO market, which relies very heavily on providing many services in that space. And will the CROs automate themselves, or will they be a victim to automation? There's a lot of let's see. So while I don't think Silicon Valley is coming for pharma, I do think there is another stakeholder we don't talk about much that will be coming for pharma if pharma doesn't do right by them. And those are organized patients themselves. Because we've seen time and again that when patients come together, they actually can do just about every step of the pharma R&D process, from discovery through to funding of research, through to running studies that collect and share data on patients at scale. Time and again, we've seen that patients can come together and use open innovation and DIY biohacking or funding of basic science, crowdfunding of clinical research, data sharing on sharing platforms. All of the incremental steps that pharma has had the privilege of owning for years because we've had the money and the process nailed down. So I do think that organized patients could be an incredibly disruptive force to pharma R&D in the coming years. And hopefully, as we increase some daylight that that's the real threat, it will keep pharma on their toes to make sure that we are doing right and including patients in this process. I believe that will create a very meaningful check and balance for pharma, because if we in pharma do not, patients don't need us. They can do this more and more themselves. We'd spoken a little bit ago about how technology is democratizing access to tools. You don't have to have the budgets of big pharma to access electronic data capture anymore. People can do more and more of this on their own. You could launch a research kit study using Apple tools for free. Hopefully, the more we talk about that, the more we will appreciate in pharma our privilege of serving patients and respect that, meet that demand, or step aside and let them take care of this.
That would be all for today. So we want to thank you for your time and for your insights. We appreciate them endlessly. You are so enthusiastic. It's so great to see people like you in the industry. So thank you again.
Hey, this was my pleasure, Anna. Thanks so much for having me here. Let's do this again sometime.
Yes, definitely. We are very down to that.
Thank you for watching. If you would like to be our next guest speaker, reach out. You can find the right email in the comment section below. And don't forget to subscribe.